Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
That's right.
A book that's been really influential, I think, in gender studies and really beyond that field as well. And we're here to break it down in a way that's hopefully insightful and, dare I say, enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Gender Troubles is really a must-read, I think, for anyone who wants to understand how we think about gender today. But it can be a little dense.
It can be.
And we're here to help you extract those key insights, those aha moments that make you see the world a little differently.
For sure. And one of the big ones right off the bat is this question of what does woman even mean?
Yeah.
It's a question that's so central to feminist thought. But Butler kind of flips the script a little bit and asks, like, is woman this stable category, that we can build a movement around? Or is it something that's a lot more fluid and complex than that?
Yeah, I mean, so much of feminist activism has focused on gaining rights for women and gaining equality for women. But Butler is asking us to think about if that assumption of this kind of like universal woman category could actually be doing more harm than good.
Exactly. And, she argues that this assumed universality can actually mask this huge diversity of experiences among women, particularly women who face multiple forms of oppression, based on race and class and sexuality and so on. And she really drives this point home, I think, with this really powerful quote. It is not enough to inquire into how women might become more fully represented in language and politics. Feminist critique ought also to understand how the category of women, the subject of feminism, is produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation is sought.
It's a lot to unpack there. But I think what she's getting at is that this focus on just the category woman might actually limit our feminist goals because it kind of ignores those very real differences and the power dynamics within that category.
Yeah, you got it. And it raises this question, can feminist politics actually function without relying on this fixed category of woman? It's a question that's still being debated today, but it really forces us to think critically about who gets included and who gets excluded when we make these assumptions about what it means to be a woman.
This whole discussion reminds me of Simone de Beauvoir's famous quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." It seems to be getting at a similar idea.
Absolutely. Both de Beauvoir and Butler are challenging this notion of a pre-existing or inherent gender identity. They're saying that gender is dynamic, that it's fluid, and that it's constantly being shaped by social and cultural forces around us.
Okay, so if gender isn't this inner truth that we're born with, then how does this becoming happen? What shapes our sense of gender identity?
This is where Butler introduces one of her most influential ideas. This idea of gender as performance. She argues that gender isn't something that we are, but rather something that we do. It's an act that we repeat, a script that we follow, rather than an essence that we possess.
So you're saying that gender is like a theatrical performance?
Exactly. Think about it. We have these roles, man and woman, with these specific costumes and gestures, ways of speaking, expectations for how to behave. And we learn these roles from a very young age, and we perform them every day, often without even realizing it.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. So it's like we're all on a stage, putting on a show, playing the part of man or woman, according to the script that we've been given.
Exactly. And Butler captures this so well in another one of her quotes. She says, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results."
So the act of performing gender is creating this illusion of a stable inner identity, even if there's not really anything fixed behind it?
Yeah.
Wow. I never really thought about it that way. But it makes so much sense when you put it that way. All those little things we do, the way we dress, how we walk, even how we sit, is all part of this performance.
It is. And think about how powerful that is. It means that even though these gender roles can feel so restrictive, they're ultimately created and contained by us.
So if we're the ones creating them, could we also be the ones to change them? But before we get to that, can you give us some real-world examples of this gender performance in action? Like, how do we do gender in everyday life without even realizing it?
I mean, think about how men are often expected to be, like, stoic and strong and not show a lot of emotion. That's a performance.
Right.
Or how women are often pressured to be thin and beautiful and always put together. That's a performance too. These aren't necessarily conscious choices, but they're learned behaviors that get reinforced over and over again.
Yeah, it's like we're all following these invisible scripts and we get rewarded for playing our parts well or punished for deviating from the norm.
Exactly. And this kind of leads us to another really crucial concept in gender trouble, this idea of the heterosexual matrix.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So think of it as this dominant cultural system. That tells us there are only two genders, male and female, and that they're naturally attracted to each other. It links sex, gender, and desire in this really rigid binary framework.
So it's not just about individual performances, but it's about this larger system that kind of dictates how those performances should look and what the consequences are for stepping outside the lines.
Exactly. The heterosexual matrix really limits the possibilities. For anyone who doesn't fit neatly into those boxes, it reinforces heteronormativity, and it makes it much harder to imagine different ways of expressing gender and sexuality.
And Butler draws on the work of other feminist theorists here, like Monique Wittig, who I think takes his critique even further. Wittig argues that the categories of man and woman are themselves tools of oppression, used to maintain this rigid system and limit individual expression.
Right. Wittig really sees the language of sex itself as problematic because it creates this false sense of naturalness around something that's actually socially constructed. And she calls for a radical disruption of these categories, arguing that they're inherently limiting and exclusionary.
So we're not just talking about tweaking the performance a little bit or bending the rules, but about fundamentally questioning these categories that define our identities.
Yeah.
It's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But it really makes you think. What if we could imagine a world beyond man and woman? What other possibilities might open up?
Right. It's a really mind-bending concept. And it's worth noting that there are different perspectives on this. Within feminist and queer theory, not everyone agrees with Wittig's call for this complete dismantling of gender categories. Some theorists, like Kate Bornstein, for example, suggest thinking of gender not as a fixed noun, but as a verb, this ongoing process of transformation.
So rather than trying to escape the system altogether, it's about finding ways to play with it, to make it more fluid and dynamic.
Exactly. Bornstein really emphasizes this fluidity, this constant change that's inherent in our relationship to gender. She sees it as a journey of self-discovery and creative expression, rather than this destination with fixed coordinates.
That's a really empowering way to think about it. So we've got these different perspectives on how to challenge the heterosexual matrix from this radical disruption to more of a creative transformation. But how does this play out in the real world? How do people actually push back against these norms?
Well, Butler explores this idea of subversive bodily acts. These are actions and expressions that deliberately disrupt gender norms.
So we're talking about things like drag and cross-dressing, or even body mortification.
Exactly. These acts become ways of exposing the artificiality of the gender binary, showing that it's not some natural order, but this constructed set of rules that we can choose to follow or break.
I love that. It's like taking that theatrical performance we talked about earlier and turning it into this powerful form of protest by exaggerating or playing with gender norms. These subversive acts make them seem less like unchangeable truths and more like costumes that we can choose to wear or discard.
Exactly. And it really ties back to Butler's point about the body as a site of both regulation and potential subversion.
Right.
We're constantly bombarded with messages about how our bodies should look and behave based on our assigned gender. But these subversive acts reclaim the body as a canvas for individual expression, a tool for challenging those very norms.
It's like saying, you don't get to tell me what my body means. I get to decide that.
Right. And these acts of defiance can have this ripple effect, inspiring others to question those gender roles that they've been taught to accept without question.
It's like those moments in history where people start to see the cracks in the system and realize, hey, maybe things don't have to be this way. But speaking of systems, I'm curious about how this idea of gender as performance, this challenge to the heterosexual matrix, plays out in the realm of science. We often think of science as being objective and neutral, but Butler suggests that even scientific research can be influenced by gendered assumptions.
Absolutely. And she uses this really fascinating case study to illustrate this point, a study from MIT that claimed to have found the master gene for sex determination.
Okay, so this study was looking for a biological basis for why some people develop as male and others as female.
Exactly. The researchers were really focused on finding a specific gene on the Y chromosome that they believed triggered the development of male characteristics. They called it TDF, or testy determining factor.
So they found the gene that makes someone male. But what about female development?
That's the catch. The study completely ignored the possibility of
Right.
An ovary determining factor. It focused solely on male development, framing it as this active driving force, with female development as this passive default.
Hold on. So even in scientific research, these deeply ingrained cultural ideas about male dominance and female passivity were shaping the very questions being asked.
Yeah.
And the interpretations of the findings.
You got it. And this raises some really important questions about the social and political implications of scientific research. If we frame sex determination as solely dependent on this master gene located on the Y chromosome, what does that say about our understanding of gender diversity, intersex conditions, and the very fluidity of sex itself?
It seems to reinforce this rigid binary model of sex, which, as we've been discussing, can be incredibly limiting and exclusionary. It's like reducing this complexity of human biology and identity to a single genetic switch.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of critical thinking, even when it comes to scientific research. We need to be aware of the underlying assumptions, the cultural biases, and the potential consequences of how knowledge is produced and presented.
It's like we're learning to read between the lines, not just in social interactions or cultural representations, but even in the realm of science. We need to be aware of those hidden scripts, those power dynamics that shape how we understand the world around us, including our own bodies. But if we're all performing gender, if these categories aren't as fixed as they seem, does that mean we can just choose whatever gender we want, regardless of our bodies or biology?
That's a great question. And it gets at one of the, I think, most common misconceptions about Butler's work. She's not saying that we can just pick and choose our gender identities, like we're shopping for clothes or something.
Right.
It's not about denying the reality of our bodies or the influence of biology. But she does suggest that because gender is performative, it's also inherently unstable and open to change.
Okay, so how does that work? How can something that's meant to control and restrict us also offer a path to liberation?
Well, think about it this way. Gender relies on constant repetition, on all of us playing our parts according to the script. But that repetition also creates the possibility for variation, for disruption, for those moments where the performance breaks down and reveals the kind of artifice behind it.
I like that. It's like those moments in a play where an actor forgets their lines, or it goes off script. It can be jarring, but it also reminds us that it's just a performance, not real life.
Exactly. And those disruptions can be incredibly powerful. They can challenge the audience's expectations and make them question the story that they thought they were watching. And in the case of gender, those disruptions can open up spaces for new ways of thinking about identity expression and possibility.
So if we're all performing gender, maybe we can start rewriting the script. Maybe we can create new roles, new ways of expressing ourselves that challenge those limiting binaries and open up more inclusive possibilities.
That's the hope. And that's, I think, where Butler's work leaves us, with this incredible sense of possibility. If gender isn't some predetermined destiny, if it's something we actively create through our actions and interactions, then maybe we can collectively work towards a world where those performances are more diverse, more liberating, and more authentic to who we truly are.
It's like we're being given this invitation to step off the stage, examine the costumes and the props, and then come back and create something entirely new, something that reflects the full spectrum of human experience.
That's the beauty of Gender Trouble. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it does give us the tools to ask critical questions, to challenge assumptions, and to imagine a world beyond the limitations of the gender binary.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What parts of your own gender expression feel most like a performance? What norms do you challenge, consciously or unconsciously? And what possibilities for change or disruption do you see in your own life?
These are just some of the questions, I think, that Butler's work provokes. And Gender Trouble is really just the beginning of a much larger conversation, a journey of exploration and self-discovery that continues to unfold.
We encourage you to continue that journey, to keep questioning, keep challenging, and keep creating new possibilities for yourself and for the world around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.